In our last video, we talked about how to use essential oils and bitters to help the body deal with biofilm infections. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit more in depth about bitters. As hunter-gatherers, we had a lot of bitter food in our diet. Bitter is the most common flavor in the plant kingdom. Bitter compounds are how plants protect themselves from parasites and from being overgrazed by herbivores. We have a handful of receptors to recognize sweet, sour, spicy, salty tastes, but we have over 34 genes that can recognize over 100 different bitter compounds. Why so many? Well, one, it's to keep us from eating poisonous plants. But the other is it helps us know which plants are actually medicinal for us. Animals haven't lost this ability. If you watch a sick animal, it will often go off to eat plants that normally it wouldn't eat. It's trying to find some bitter compound that will heal it, because it's the bitter compounds where all the medicine is. So we've lost this to a degree, but herbalists would watch animals that had particular diseases go and eat certain plants, and then that was how they figured out that those plants were good for us. What they were actually getting were the bitter elements from the plants. Now, with the agricultural revolution 14,000 years ago on the Nile River, we learned how to start breeding plants to do what we wanted. And what we wanted was for them to be sweeter and less bitter. So over thousands of years, we've been pulling the bitters, the medicinals, out of our food supply. Now, early man was a bit more intuitive than we are now, and they knew they had to put the bitters back in. So they did it in two ways. They would make teas, because putting bitter plants in hot water could extract the water-soluble bitter compounds. So they would put bitter leaves, bark, roots, flowers, seeds, peels of fruit in hot water, and then that would become tea. The other way they would do it would be to put these bitter plant parts into alcohol, and that would extract the alcohol-soluble bitter fractions from the plants. The first recipe for this is 9,000 years ago in China, where they would put hawthorn berries in their alcohol. In India, 2,500 years ago, there's record of putting wormwood in alcohol, and that was good for parasite infections. And one of the most famous herbalists with bitters was a fellow, King Mithridates of Pontus, and he reasoned that if he were to continually take bitter poisonous plants at low doses, he could become immune to poisons. And this is a concern if you're a king, because that's one way that people were assassinated. So he made mixes, and as legend goes, he became immune to being poisoned. Now, what he used became a bit of a holy grail to herbalists. We don't know the exact formula, but based on where he lived and what he said that he would be mixing, an aromatic and a bitter, which is an essential oil and a bitter, it's reasonable to think that ginger and gentian were probably two of the ingredients he was using. For centuries thereafter, kings would hire herbalists to make them bitter drinks that they would take on a regular basis to protect them from being poisoned. And it works. It makes your body very resistant to toxicity. Another example for this is Rasputin, who was an herbalist and gained favor with the Russian czars by helping their children who had hemophilia. At one point in time, there was a falling out, and some of the royal family tried to poison him with, I believe, enough cyanide to kill several people instantly. And they laced some wine and cake and gave it to him, and Rasputin ate it as if nothing had happened. So there's another example historically of bitters providing incredible protection against toxins. So for thousands of years, bitter alcoholic beverages and teas were part of the protocol to maintain good health. Like we said in the previous video, you want something that you can do as a maintenance dose because persister cells from biofilms will reinfect given the opportunity. And tea and a little bit of wine mixed with some herbs is a great way to do that. What happened was, in the 1800s, morphine and cocaine became commercially available. And some unscrupulous herbalists would mix them into their herbal elixirs and sell them. And they would have great results because morphine is a great painkiller and cocaine is a stimulant, and they'd feel good. And this culminated in the 18th, 19th centuries with traveling medicine shows, which were vaudeville acts where they would have some morphine or cocaine with some herbs, and there would be a show, and a strong man would come out and show how strong he was based on the drink, and there'd be shills in the audience that would give testimonials, and a lot of people became addicted to these things. Some of them had mercury in them for syphilis, so some of them were quite toxic, and some of them were good. There were still good herbalists at the time. But then in 1899, aspirin was invented, and then insulin and penicillin 20 years later, and these were real life-saving drugs. Now, penicillin would save someone's life, and so could insulin. And legislation was passed to put an end to these drugged herbal mixes with the morphine and the cocaine. Unfortunately, the damage had been done. A lot of people now associated herbalism with charlatanism and addictive drugs, and it was considered unscientific at best and addictive or toxic at worst. So we lost our connection to bitters. They weren't in the food, and now we weren't taking them as teas or as in alcoholic tinctures. But we instead went to doctors when diseases got bad enough. The challenge is doctors at this point in time were mostly dealing with acute crises, and for chronic conditions they didn't have a really great solution because those were all found in the bitter medicinals in the plants. But half of all drugs that are being prescribed today actually work on the same family of receptors that bitter compounds work on. So actually, modern doctors are prescribing bitters in the drugs. Now, the question then is, what can we do if we want to have some kind of continual bitter element coming into our bodies? If we want to be strong like Mithridates and Rasputin, then we're going to need to challenge our liver, because it was designed to get a background stimulus of bitter elements to stay healthy. It's like going to the gym. If you never exercise, the body becomes weak, and then you go to the gym and you get strong. If you never have bitters in your diet, because we have bred them out through our agricultural practices and no longer do herbal protocols, then the liver and the detox capacity gets weak. So what can we do to send our liver to the gym? What can we do to strengthen our detox capacity? And what I pose to you is teas, the bitter teas, not the peppermints, but the ones that taste pretty intense. Or you can do something like an herbal extract. So what's a good protocol if you want to bring bitters back into your lifestyle? We make a product called Zoibin, which is actually, I believe, quite close to what King Mithridates was doing. It's got the aromatics, which are essential oils, and the bitters. So we have the clove, ginger, oregano, and thyme. And then for the bitters, we have berberine and gentian. And what you do is shake it up, because the elements in here will separate, and just put a little bit on your tongue. Like that, a couple of times a day. It's actually quite good before a meal because it'll stimulate digestion. Now, what you can't see that's actually happening right now is thousands of genes are being activated in my body to open up and do different things. There's genes that are activating detoxification in my liver. There are genes that are activating my white blood cells to be more functional. There are genes that are lowering my blood pressure. So while it's great to have pharmaceuticals when you need them, half the US population at age 50 are on one or more pharmaceuticals. What I'd suggest is think about taking bitters as your medicine when possible. Have something that is going to activate the bitter receptors, and then you might just find that if you do that often enough, you don't need to go to the more intense pharmaceuticals as often.